Gary, your handwriting is better than mine. There are times we've done prayer requests, but I cannot read my own handwriting. Part of it because I'm in a hurry, but thank you. I wanted to talk to the youth. They're going to help me Sunday morning. We're going to do Children's Church Sunday morning due to the subject matter of Sunday's sermon. We're doing Lust Sunday morning, so bring everyone you know. So I want to get rid of all the kids. So the youth have volunteered. So the whites are going to be really busy. You got nursery, and then the youth will be. You won't have the other kids, just the nursery. So don't panic. No. Charlotte goes, "Don't I already have nursery?" Yes. We're not talking about nursery. I'm not going to dump all the kids on you. So I'm grateful for them. And we have a lot of students who will do just about anything. They're really quick to volunteer. So I'm really grateful for them. Let's grab our Bibles and let's turn to Genesis 30. Help if I turn there. So Genesis 30. We want to cover a good chunk of the chapter. And there we go. Let's see if it's working now. Oh, I bet you got a security thing up. I'm so sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. Make sure that's on. Yeah. Well, Genesis there. So remember where we left off last time is we saw the first, 4 kids born to Leah. So you have Rachel and Leah married to Jacob, or the deceiver was deceived by his now father-in-law, Laban. And so now he has his 2 wives. And here we're going to get, for the most part, the 12 tribes of Israel. By the end of what we read, Benjamin still won't be born at the end, but we will stop at Joseph, if Lord willing. So we saw Leah at the end of chapter 29, and it picks up. So remember that when the Bible was written, it didn't have chapter breaks. So originally, where we left off last week, that's part of the same narrative. We just, you have to break it down at some point. So as we pick up in chapter 30, we'll look at each of these. Let's start in verse 1, chapter 30. When Rachel saw she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister. She said to Jacob, "Give me children, or I shall die." Excuse me. Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel. He said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" And then she said, "Here is my servant Bilhah, go unto her, so that she may give birth on my behalf, that even I may have children through her." So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob went unto her. Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. And Rachel said, "God has judged me, and has also heard my voice, and given me a son." Therefore she called his name Dan. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, "With mighty wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister and have prevailed." So she called his name Naphtali. So we'll pause there. You remember that the difference between Rachel and Leah is they each have a certain blessing, but instead of finding gratitude in that blessing, they turn to discontentment in what the other has that they don't. So Leah has children, but is not loved by Jacob. Therefore, she longs for the things she doesn't have rather than being grateful for the children she does have. Rachel's the opposite. She has the love and affection of her husband, Jacob, but instead of being grateful for that, she enviously longs for what Leah has. This is covetousness in a nutshell. And so verse 1 makes it very, very clear that when Rachel saw that Leah had those children, she envied her sister. Now, this idea of envy has been a pretty common theme in recent chapters, particularly with the Isaac-Jacob narrative. If we go back in the story of Isaac, the first time this word is used, I believe that's accurate, is first time it's used is with Isaac. You remember the story with where he digs a well and then people come and fill it with dirt? He goes and it's an annoying chapter. It's a very long chapter, and it's like nothing happens. He's just digging holes in the desert, right? And you remember what was the motivation there? In the middle of a famine, God was blessing Isaac, and no one else is being blessed. And so instead of going to Isaac and saying, you're doing something right, if we can do what you're doing, we can better feed our families. Instead, what they say is, we don't like that what you're doing is successful. We want to ruin your success. But we love sharing our misery. We love it. We absolutely love it. Have you ever noticed in sports, if you have a dynasty, UCLA back in the 70s, or the Patriots more recently, the Bulls in the 90s, the Pistons before that, the Lakers before them, the Celtics before them, so on and so forth. You get a dynasty in sports. After about 3 championships, everyone roots against them. Have you ever noticed that? How many of y'all don't like Tom Brady simply because he has won everything? Right? Me. I don't like LeBron James. For no other reason than he's just won everything, right? I don't like it. I didn't like Kobe Bryant until he retired, or Michael Jordan until he retired. Right? He just won everything. I didn't like that. We love to share our misery. I mean, really think about that. I bet you have a family member, maybe it's a sibling or something like that, that they just seem extra special. You know, everything they touch turns to gold, and everyone praises them. And instead of celebrating them, you're just bitter towards them. And there's no logical explanation for your bitterness. Right? Well, that's what happens to Isaac. Now, later, this word envy will return. So we have it with Isaac, we have Rachel and Leah, the story of Jacob. Later, it is Jacob's sons who get it from their mothers, who gets it from their from their grandparents. So in Genesis 37:11, we get this, and his brothers envied him, Joseph. But his father observed the same. This is when Joseph comes and says, hey, I had these dreams, you're all going to bow down to me. Right? They envied him. It's the same word used here to describe Rachel's envy of Leah. Now remember that in the story, the women are caught up in this drama. And what we see, what envy and covetousness and discontentment, all that does, is it makes victims of everyone around you. They never pause and think, my responsibility to my children trumps the desires of my heart. And what we see is they drag their children into this family drama so that when the story moves from Jacob to his sons, they're committing the same sins as their parents did. After all, that's all they know. Have you ever thought about that? I bet you have someone you love who married someone who has a temper. Okay? And I bet if you did a little bit of research, that's how they were raised. And it gets frustrating, isn't it? Because I bet they grew up, not universally, but you'll find this, that if you grew up in a home that is chaotic, chaos is orderly to you, because that's all you know. So if you didn't get your way, you scream. If you don't like what someone did, you sabotage them. That's what mom and dad did all the time. That's what your siblings and you did all the time. So you enter into this marriage, and probably what attracted you to that person is they bring some peace. But the minute conflict shows up in your marriage, all you know is scream. Right? I mean, what else do you expect from some Jacob's boys when their mothers are acting like this, and Jacob is just a scoundrel himself? So no wonder and Joseph's going to suffer. He's spend most of his life away from home, away from everyone else because of all that. Well, we got to move forward here. Let me give you Proverbs 14:30. A tranquil heart gives life to the flesh, but envy makes the bones rot. Love that. We've looked at that before. Well, again, Rachel's deeply loved by Jacob, and instead of gratitude, she turns to anger and resentment. And she demands Jacob impregnate her. Now, let's look at what envy does to her. You can look at this logically, right? Think about it. She goes to her husband, and she sees that Leah has all these kids. And she says, Jacob, it's your fault. Impregnate me. Just pause there. If Jacob is sleeping with 2 women, and one of them is getting pregnant and the other one is not, it is illogical in this scenario for the one that is barren to blame it on the man who has impregnated the other woman. So my point here is not to bring up what can be touchy subject. My point here is that when we are consumed with idolatry, this is a heart issue, logic goes out the window. This is what malice is, when you take anger and you put a little action to it, illogical action. This is when you start keying cars. Right? This is when you start throwing things out in the front yard, right? Our neighbors did that several years ago. I come home, my wife says, we may need to do something. See our neighbor's front yard? Yeah. This guy is just dragging clothes in front of him. I don't know, they're having an argument. Like, well, that's malice, right? There's nothing logical about any of that. Nothing, right? And that's what Rachel is doing. She's so consumed with resentment that it goes out the window. Notice, her entire identity is tied to motherhood. Now, is motherhood a good thing? In Genesis, it's absolutely a fantastic thing. It's a God-given thing. Remember that be fruitful and multiply is the blessing. We see this in the Exodus narrative, that the children are the blessing. So what she wants is a good thing, but now it's become an all-consuming God thing. And so what she is saying is, I cannot live unless I am given this. Right? So discontentment is what makes rich men poor, right? Here she has the love and affection of a husband. How many women right now in this world are longing for that? She has it. But discontentment makes us poor. Contentment makes poor men rich. If she would say, yes, I want a good thing, but I will grow in appreciation and gratitude for what I do have, that would make you, in this context, a better mother, frankly. Because now children aren't the means to an end. They are the ends. And so she comes here, and it's clear her identity. And her identity is motivated by hate and anger and resentment. So, but notice, ironically, this puts Rachel in the same boat as Leah. Leah bore children out of resentment. She was unloved. Children became the victim. Rachel wants children out of resentment. She is barren. Children become the victim. Same narrative from two different sides. Now, by demanding Jacob impregnate her, she's failing to follow the example of her mother-in-law and father-in-law, Isaac and Rebekah. Remember that just as Sarah was infertile, so was Rebekah. You remember what Jacob and Rebekah did? They prayed. So you get to Genesis 25. Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. So what you'll find here is this is a secular approach to a problem. God is rarely mentioned except after the fact. And this becomes a problem when we get to the weird mandrakes. Okay, Jacob's response, verse 2, we got to move. Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel. He said, am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? A couple things to say here. One, well, Jacob rebukes his wife, yes, but what do we do with it? First of all, I think he has a point, wouldn't you say? At the end of the day, she should have turned to God in prayer, not to Jacob in anger. That's really worth meditating on. Because when you lash out in anger at someone else, that's not going to help your relationship. If we spent more time in prayer, we'd save a lot of drama in our lives. And that's really his point. Am I in the place of God? Talk to him. Right? And he's reminding her that God is the one who blesses and withholds. At the same time, I do think he's a bit harsh. I'm not sure this is how you should talk to your wife, is the short end of the stick, right? I don't think you should say, look here, it ain't my problem, it's Jesus's, right? I'm not sure that's a pastoral husbandry way of handling it, right? So I do think he might be a little harsh. And many more modern scholars see it that way. The sharpness of his rebuke may be a bit too much. And I would encourage here Jacob to pray for Rachel as, again, Isaac had prayed for Rebekah. Well, verses 3 to 5, tell me if this story sounds familiar. Rachel can't conceive, so she goes to her servant, introduced in chapter 28-29, and says, take my servant, this is concubinage, sleep with her, and have children through her. That story sound familiar? Yeah, dear old granddad did that. How'd that work out for granddad? Verily I say unto thee, not very good. Isaac has an uncle he has not seen in a long time because of this. An uncle on Hagar's side. I mean, figure that one out, right? So, that didn't work. Now remember, in Genesis, repetition of these stories is important. Eastern world, you've heard me say it 1,000 times, life is cyclical. Western world, life is linear, beginning, end. Biblically, we see that it is both. That each generation is just going to make the same goofy mistakes, right? We've looked at this almost every chapter of Genesis. Isaac repeats the same sins of Abraham. Jacob's repeating the same sins of Abraham. On it goes. Israel will repeat the same sins as Abraham. And they will repeat the same sins as Moses, if you will. So we already know this is not going to go well. The text wants us to see the connection. So in chapter 16 here, Sarah to Abraham, and then here we just read Rachel. You can see the similarities. Of course, that's English. You can see it better in Hebrew, but you can see she's making the same request. Now, notice verse 3, the exact language. Here's my servant Bilhah, go into her so that she may give birth on my behalf. Does anyone have anything other than behalf? Knees. What in the Sam Hills? Or as my daughter likes to say, what in the Sam of the Hills?
She's
right?
going to be right there and catch that kid.
Yes. It is also a term that is basically the language of adoption. So the knees is your lap. And so by putting the child in your lap, the child now becomes, if you will, your possession. This is adoption. A modern term would be concubinage. Not a concubinage. Surrogate. Yeah, those are two very different words. Surrogacy. Now, if you can go somewhere back in the archives, I just lambasted surrogacy. This is a major problem we're having in the pro-life movement we're not talking about. Particularly in your major cities where the LGBT community is very high up. We have major figures among the cultural elites who, because of their homosexuality, cannot conceive. I don't know if you all knew that or not. But they want children, and they don't want to go through adoption, so they will get a surrogate. Now, who do we target with that? Poor women. They become wombs for hire. And what do you do with women when their wombs are no longer fertile? You couldn't care less about them anymore. Right? We should be concerned with that. It's much like frozen embryos. These are pro-life issues we never talk about. Right now, this is free. Right now, there are image bearers of God suspended in time. Frozen embryos. Embryos, not just egg and sperm. I'm talking about embryos, fertilized eggs, frozen. And the laws can't keep up with it. I've given you these examples. I've got a book out if you want to read some examples where you have siblings who are 12 years apart, twins, 12 years apart. This is a problem with in vitro fertilization. As in general, I'm not against it, but what you usually do is you fertilize multiple eggs because it's cheaper that way. And if you conceive, so let's say with the first egg, what do you do with the other, say, 4 eggs? Many of them are donated to science either to be frozen or to be experimented upon, embryonic stem cell research. So I think the pro-life movement, even after the Dobbs decision, has a lot that we have to think about. That's free. That was in my notes. Notice here that envy is motivating Rachel to violate her marriage vows. Now, this practice was common in the ancient Near Eastern world. The example of Sarah makes this very clear. But we have other examples. Code of Hammurabi mentions this. This would have been a common thing. But in the Bible, it is not to be accepted. Here the Bible is quite rebellious against the culture there. Notice the language in verse 4. Bilhah is described as wife. And she would have been considered wife. However, now what you have in this relationship, in this home, is you have a tier of wives. You have the wives, Rachel and Leah, and then you've got the wives, which is going to be Bilhah and the other one. The one starts with Z. It's leaving me. We'll come to her. That's not good. Right? Monogamy works. Bigamy and polygamy don't. Right? The Bible makes that just very, very clear. This is a mess because of bigamy. So we meet the first kid, first son of Rachel, put that in quotes. That is Dan. His name means a judge. He's the 5th son of Jacob. He is the first son of Bilhah. Rachel interprets Dan's birth as a vindication for her envy, anger, and violation of her marriage vows. What she's saying is, God approved of what I did. Now, the reader knows better than that. God didn't approve of Sarah doing this Hagar. So here is, and you're going to see this all the time. I prayed for the wrong thing, for something that the Bible says is wrong. But because things seem to have worked out, God approved. That's not the way life works. All right? If you drive Mach 90 down this highway today and you don't get pulled over, does not mean the laws have changed or you're an exemption of them. It's not how it works. But that's the way she takes it. That God has vindicated her in her anger. No, God would pause and say, before we talk about you as a mother, let's talk about you as a woman. And we need to address these anger and this envy issue. But she believes otherwise. She thinks that God has approved of her righteousness. She even claims that God has heard her voice. Now that language is interesting. Remember in Genesis, to listen to someone's voice is important. The question is, whose voice are you going to listen to? Remember that Adam listened to the voice of his wife instead of the voice of God? Here, she is saying God listened to her voice rather than Rachel listening to the voice of God. That's dangerous. That's dangerous. That's idolatry, putting yourself on the throne of God. Well, Jacob will play with Dan's name and his prophetic blessing. I don't know if we'll look at all these blessings. Did I not put it up there? I may not have. Here it is. Her talking about God hearing her mirrors that of Leah. We talked about that last week. Here's Jacob's blessing on Dan. Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. See the play on words. Dan means a judge, so Dan will a Dan, right? Basically, okay? He is a serpent in the way, a viper by the path that bites the horse's heels. You do with that whatever you want. In verses 7 and 8, we meet the second son of Rachel, is Naphtali. His name means my wrestling. Like her sister, the name reflects her spiritual condition. She sees her second son as besting, if you will, her sister Leah. She is wrestling against Leah. Now, remember, there's a baby right there. And she couldn't care less about the well-being of the baby. She cares only about trumping her sister. This is why envy is just so dangerous. Resentment and anger and malice and discontentment, so dangerous. So she now sees it that she has two sons and the affection of her husband. Therefore, she's better than Leah. I have to trump her. That's the only thing that matters. I have to trump her. I mean, they're acting like middle school boys, aren't they? I mean, it's really amazing. I practiced yesterday. I've told you all this 1,000 times, where they're always trying to up each other. You know, middle school boys, there you go. And I don't know, yesterday, about 4 times, I had this, one was like, watch me kick this real quick, we're doing a drill. Watch me, like, no, don't kick it. The girls aren't paying attention to you on the other side of the field. You have no reason to kick it, okay? I'm not impressed by you. I'm a 38-year-old man. 13-year-olds don't impress me anymore, all right? They stopped impressing me when I was 12, okay? You know, right? Stop, okay? You know, but they're always like, oh, I can do better. You know, that's what Rachel and Leah are doing here. Well, I'm gonna skip Jacob's blessing. You read in chapter 49. Moses gives another blessing, Deuteronomy 33, if you want to read it. Well, in response to this, Leah seeks her own revenge, starting in verse 9. When Leah saw that she had ceased bearing children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Then Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son, and Leah said, "Good fortune has come," so she called his name Gad. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son, and Leah said, "Happy am I, for women have called me happy." So she called his name Asher. So here is Leah's revenge. Now remember, Leah already has 4 children with Jacob. But that's not good enough, is it? When you are motivated by envy and discontentment, you will never have enough. Never have enough. Envy and all that is, for one, it's drinking poison, hoping the other person dies, right? That's what Rachel thought she got with Naphtali. It is also drinking ocean water, wondering why you're thirsty. You just consume and consume and consume and consume. I gave this illustration at TFCA last time I spoke there. How Bushmen they find water is they get baboons who love salt. And so they'll get a bunch of salt and they put it in a hole, and a baboon will come and they'll grab the salt, right? The problem is that when they put their hand in the hole and they grab the salt, they can't get it out of the hole. Too small. Now, if they let go of the salt, they can get their hand back out just fine. But the problem is they don't want to let go of the salt. They refuse to let go of it. So what the bushman will do is he will then capture them, put them in a cage, and then feed the baboon all the salt he could ever consume. But the problem with salt, as you know, is it makes you thirsty. That's true of baboons. So after they've consumed enough salt, they let the baboon go, and they follow the baboon to the nearest source of water. That's how they find water. Now, all the baboon had to do was let go of the salt. Just let it go. But he doesn't want to let go. He wants the salt more than his freedom. Until you get to the point that you're dying of thirst. That's the problem with Rachel and Leah here. It's the problem with most of us. We don't want to let go of the salt. We think it's the salt that gives us happiness. Here, in this case, it's the affection of a husband, to be called mother. But it could be 1,000 other things. We won't let go of the salt. Right? We already have in Christ all that we really need. So, in verse 9, we find out that Leah ceased bearing. This goes back to the end of Genesis 29. She ceased bearing. We talked about what does that mean necessarily. But clearly, time has gone on and she hasn't conceived. And so what she does is exactly what Rachel does. God blessed Rachel, didn't he? It worked for her. It'll work for me. And so now you have another surrogate here is Zilpah. And she bears, this is Leah's sixth son, if you will, Gad, in verses 10 through 11. And his name either means troop or it means good fortune or luck. It really means good fortune because of how it works in the text. However, Jacob's prophecy in Genesis 49 describes him as in a military term. So troop works as well. Moses will have his own thing. But just the language he uses is quite striking, that she is fortunate, not that the child is the blessing. It's a great name for a child. But she's fortunate because now she has another one on top of her sister. That's the fortunate part. And then they have Asher in verse 12 through Zilpah. His name means happy. So the verse plays on this word. Asher am I, happy am I. And notice this, women have called me happy. Now notice that's past tense, but it's like a prophetic past tense. You get this in the Bible where things yet to happen are written in the past tense. It's a way of saying this is a certainty, right? I guess the closest we have is when we say I'm gonna, or when Babe Ruth calls his shot, right? I think it's the closest we have. So the prophets will say that Babylon is destroyed, for example. Well, no, it's not. They're still doing their thing. But it's prophetic certainty. She does the same thing here. She thinks by the conception of Asher, women now will, not just Rachel, because she doesn't want Rachel's affection. She wants Rachel's envy. That's the thing about envy, is being envious of someone. What we really want is for them to be envious of us. But the truth is, I'm the one that's envious. That's why you can't play those games. And so what she wants is for all the women to be happy for her and to jealous of her, which makes it worse for her sister. But where there is conflict between two people, give it enough time, say 12 minutes or so, it will involve more people than just two. It will always happen that way. You will always look for allies. You will always look for people to have your back, to justify your actions, to tell you you're in the right. It will always happen that way. Here she is. All these women, they're going to think I'm great. They're going to say I'm happy. All right. Now, Asher's a great name for a kid. Happy. Moms, aren't you happy that you had a baby? Yeah. I'll never forget the hospital at North Suburban where we had Elijah. They were very big on the skin when you have a baby. And of course, we didn't have a clue what we were doing. Now, Amanda naturally gets all that, so I'm just really there for the ride. And I mean, it was the second she saw him. She's like, gimme, 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 gimme. Woof, right? I mean, she had that baby. Like, calm down. We've got him for 18 years, right? You'll have your chance, lady. Yeesh, you know? But, oh, I got to have that baby happy, you know?
Your man
You know?
is way off.
Yeah, I know. Now it's 36, so.
18's a dream.
Yes. If God doesn't laugh at your goals, they're not set high enough. Is that what it is? So 18 will be our goal. Anyway, so all right, verse 14 to 23. I just call this worthy of Jerry Springer. Okay, so stick with me. If we get out a little late, I think we'll read. Well, you'll read this thing in Wanting Sam Hills, or Sam of the Hills, as my daughter would say. This is by far the most bizarre part of the story. Verse 14. In the days of wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. So Reuben, the firstborn, he's out there getting mandrakes. Brings it to his mother. Nothing odd about that. Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also? Laugh all you want. But if we could hit reverse on your life, you've had arguments like this. I'll tell you what the McDaniel argument is. Grilled cheese. That sounds goofy. Mom fixed grilled cheese. And we were all adults there. I think I was married, I don't know. But we were all adults. My brother and sister and I were all there. All of us are adults. So I'm not talking about we're six-year-olds or anything like that. We're all adults. And there's 2 grilled cheese sandwiches left. I grabbed one. I took the other and said, well, we don't want it to waste it. I grabbed it and I kind of chucked it on my brother's plate who's sitting right next to me. And he looks at me and he says, I don't want the grilled cheese. And he puts it back on the original plate. Like, dude, it's a grilled cheese. It's not about the grilled cheese. Dude, it's a grilled cheese. It's not about the, right? That's our entire argument, right? You know, you've had arguments like this to this day. We joke about it. If I fix a grilled cheese for the family, I'll call my brother up, say, hey, you want some grilled cheese, right? Like, we joke about it now. But I remember my mom and dad are like, grilled cheese? Hey, you guys are going to throw down over grilled cheese, right? Right? You've had this. It's not about the mandrakes. It's not about the grilled cheese. I mean, so what you have is all this conflict and this battling back and forth. Well, pick up with the story. We're halfway through verse 15. Rachel said, then he may lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes. When Jacob came from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, you must come into me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes. So he lay with her that night. God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a 5th son. Leah said, God has given me my wages because I gave my servant to my husband. So she called his name Issachar. This is by far the most bizarre part. What in the world do we do with this? Well, what's the deal with the mandrakes? Well, a couple of things is that mandrakes were viewed as an aphrodisiac and as an aid to fertility. And so think about what the issue you have here is Leah now has mandrakes. And it is her son, her oldest son, who got the mandrakes. And so you have Rachel, who is an aunt. Yeah? And instead of loving Reuben, Reuben is part of the problem. She doesn't want Reuben to be there. Because Reuben represents everything Rachel's always wanted. To be a mom, to have her own child. So the firstborn, the son of promise, we would think, he gets these mandrakes with all the symbolism that comes with them and brings them to Leah, the woman she hates the most. And she goes and says, can I have those mandrakes? And Leah, now let's just say it's an innocent question. There's a lot of baggage in the background. Leah interprets it not as a simple request, but with sinister meaning behind it. Your answer is it enough you've taken my husband? Now you're going to take a gift from my son. They're mandrakes. It's grilled cheese. Now, it's goofy, but we all do this. We all do this. Now, notice what Rachel does. she will dehumanize Jacob, and she will prostitute him. You give me the mandrakes. Why? She wants to have children. Not through a servant. Sarah did the same thing. It wasn't enough to have children through a servant. You've got to have your own. You can't have someone else's child. You have to have your own. So she will take, in exchange of mandrakes, she will give her husband to Leah. This is one of the reasons why a lot of people think that when Leah stopped conceiving, it was because Jacob ceased sleeping with her. Because here now Rachel is the guard of what Jacob does with his first wife, if you will. To use that language is just bizarre to me. Now, Jacob here is nothing more than a pawn between two bitter, angry women. This is dehumanizing. They do not see people as image bearers that they are called to love, but pawns in their hands to win this game. This is not the key to a healthy marriage, in case you were wondering. Okay? Don't do this. Notice verse 17, it says, God listened to her. Now, the irony of the story is Rachel takes the mandrakes in order to conceive, but the woman without the mandrakes conceives. That's the real irony of the story. Now, we'll get to the end, and then we realize the whole point of the story is God is the one that gives life, not mandrakes. Right? Not servants. God is the one that gives life. Now, this phrase, God listened, at least in the ESV, is used only twice in Genesis. Both times here, chapter 30, verse 17, which we just saw, and later, verse 22, when Rachel finally conceives. God listened. Now, Issachar means he provides a wage, or there is a recompense, man a reward, or even a hired man. It is a constant reminder to him that he exists because mom and my aunt couldn't get along. And they turned my father into a type of prostitutes. I mean, it's hard for us to see it that way because we don't see Jacob in that light. But think about it. If the scenario was different, if a man were to say, give me money and I'll give you this woman of mine, it's prostitution. What Rachel's doing is, give me mandrakes and I'll give you this man that I have control over. It's prostitution. And it's a marriage. It's just not good. You see that the heart issue, the inward issue, like in the Sermon on the Mount, affects you all on the outside. So Issachar is born. By the way, this whole setup, it robs intimacy of intimacy. That's the thing, is that they're not getting what it is they actually want out of any of this. And if the marriage, intimacy is vital to the health of a marriage, and they're poisoning it. Well, verse 19 to 21, we've got to move. Zebulun and Dinah are born. Leah conceived again, and she bore Jacob a sixth son. And Leah said, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will honor me because I have borne him 6 sons. So she called his name Zebulun. Afterwards she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. So while Rachel is eating her mandrakes, Leah conceives 2 final times. Right? That's the irony of the story. Zebulun means exalted or honor. Endowment, it sounds like the word endowment or gift. But it really means exalted or honored. So you can see how both the play on words shows up here. She feels she is being honored, right? But she feels that she has been gifted. So both work. And you'll notice also that the language, God has endowed, this is verse 20 rather. God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will honor me. Now at last, finally. Well, this has been Leah's problem going all the way back to chapter 29. He'll love me now. If I do this, that must mean he loves me. If I achieve this, if I have a son, that means he'll finally give me what it is that I want. And she still isn't learning the lesson. Isn't learning the lesson at all. Well, if you want Jacob's prophecy, I'm really behind on all this. I'm back on Asher. So it's 49:13. There it is. There's Zebulun's prophecy. Dinah is mentioned in passing. Her birth is barely mentioned. Her name means judgment, similar to her brother Dan. Dinah, Dan, very similar. The reason for her name is not given. However, it probably applies to the story about her that follows. It's a very grotesque story. We'll cross that bridge no time soon, hopefully. So I think it's in chapter 33 or something like that. So we'll be there soon enough. So now Leah she's done having children. And so a good chunk of the 12 tribes of Israel come either from Leah or her servant Zilpah. So finally, verse 22-24, Rachel conceives. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. She called his name Joseph. There it is. We have arrived, ain't we? Almost. Saying, may the Lord add to me another son. Well, amid all this chaos, God graciously opens her womb. Or maybe it was the mandrakes. Which one do you think it is? It's the grilled cheese. Have I never told y'all the grilled cheese story? Man, we joke about that all the time. Gosh, he got so angry at me. I guess when we were kids, Mom and Dad would let us hit each other in the arm. Right? That was sort of, they're going to fight. Put it like the safest place. And boy, we'd have whelps on our arms. And so I guess arguing over grilled cheese is I don't know, that's a step up, step down. Anyway, God remembered. It is not that God forgot about Rachel, verse 22. That language is gracious covenantal language that God will fulfill a promise. Let me give you a few examples here. Genesis 8:1. God remembered Noah, right? This is during the ark and all that sort of stuff. So he's going to keep his covenant. God will judge the earth to spare one. Later in Jesus, God will spare the earth to judge one. Jesus is the inversion of the Noahic flood. Genesis 9:15, I will remember my covenant that's between me and you, it's the rainbow. Genesis 19, so it was when God destroyed the cities of the valley, Sodom and Gomorrah. God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst, right? So God's gracious covenant and gracious act to him. So same thing, God remembered Rachel. God was always going to bless Rachel if Rachel would wait. It's the same thing with Sarah. God remembers Sarah too. But Sarah had to learn patience. Verse 23 and 24, the Hebrew says that God has removed one thing and is going to add another. He's going to remove her reproach and is going to add to her a second son. I find that amazing, don't you? Is all she's ever wanted was to be a mom. She becomes a mom, and the first thing she says is, I hope I get another one. Discontentment makes rich men poor. Contentment makes poor men rich. That's a Ben Franklin quote, supposedly. So, preacher professor of mine used that once, and I loved it. However, I want you to notice this last verse, may the Lord add to me another son. This serves as a type of an inclusio. We've looked at these before. An inclusio is like bookends, that the story opens and it ends almost exactly the same way. We've looked at these. And the Hebrew Bible in particular, but the Bible in general, is full of these. And it would be fun to catalog as many of these as we could in some sort of academic sense, but I doubt that would be an entertaining book. So let me show this to you. Genesis 29, verse 3. So this is when Rachel starts to conceive. Notice, the Lord saw that Leah was hated. He opened her womb. Rachel was barren. Notice that the word is Yahweh. I don't believe Yahweh is mentioned by the divine name until chapter 30, verse 24. She called his name Joseph, saying, may Yahweh add to me another son. Now, God is mentioned. God has removed my reproach and all that sort of stuff. But it's the generic Elohim name. But Yahweh, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but at the very least, you have Yahweh mentioned at the beginning of the birth narratives of the 12 sons of Israel. Of course, Benjamin still hasn't been born. And then he's mentioned again at the end of this narrative. So you have 11 sons and a daughter. And I think these are the only times Yahweh is mentioned. So what's the main point of the story? I think it's pretty straightforward. We've already mentioned this. And that is, God is the one who gives life. Because God is the author of all blessings. He is the blessed one who gives blessings. And what Rachel and Leah do is, by choosing to eat of the fruit, they are robbing themselves of God's blessings, even when God's blessings are right there in front of them. they don't see each son or daughter as the blessing of God. They see them as part of the bigger war against each other. This is what hate does. We're doing it as a country, aren't we? When we don't believe in truth, all we believe is in tribes. And so when we get into our little tribes, we see them as the enemy. And we never think about how our hate and our malice and our anger and our discontentment ruins people's lives and negatively affects them. But if we would see each other as image bearers, and particularly children as blessings, not pawns in our political game, or our game of power and influence and all that sort of stuff, then children are blessed. And Rachel and Leah fail at this. And what happens is for generations this becomes an issue. Out of the same hellish envy, they will cast Jacob's favorite son, the same man who has a favorite wife, they will cast him down into a pit, at which point they will then send him down into Egypt, at which point he will go down into prison, until just as God opened the wound of Rachel and Leah graciously, so too God will open the prison bars of Joseph, and he will come up out of prison. And ironically, Jacob and his sons will have to go down into Egypt, where they will see the exalted Joseph. And that's ultimately where the story is going to go in Joseph, but ultimately in Jesus, who himself has to come down out of heaven, at which point he will go down into the grave in order to be lifted up yet again. All to conquer all this envy nonsense. Boy, if we could just deal with this as human beings, how much suffering would end in this world? The ugliness of jealousy, it is a poison. The ugliness of covetousness, it's so bad, God should put it in 10 commandments. Because it's a heart issue. If you fix covetousness, you will fix the previous 9 commandments. If you fix idolatry, you won't break the 9 that follows. And if you don't believe me, read the story of Rachel and Leah. What an example it is for us. Jerry Springer would love to meet them. Okay. Yes, Don.
I think the heroes of this story was Bilhah and Zilpah, because you know who changed them kids and grew them up, don't you? It wasn't them 2 moms, because they were servants of the 2 moms.
Yeah, and you're probably right.
So I'm just glad when all that childbearing quit.
Yeah. You're probably right, but we know psychologically, sociologically, that children statistically don't have much of a chance when that happens. I was just telling Lonnie, I've been reading a book about Henry Clay. Henry Clay was so ambitious, he ended up leaving Ashland to go to Washington, D.C., left his kids behind. In fact, his wife would go with him and leave children with nannies, if you will. And the kids that went through that spent their whole childhood basically without dad and half the time mom around, did not fare well. But the one child who had daddy there did fine. We know this. We know this. If we want children to succeed, there's no secret to it. Mom and dad need to love each other. And they need to be present in the home. And there is no substitute for mom and dad, not grandparents, though that's good. Not adopted parents, though we believe firmly in adoption here in this church. There is no replacement for mom and dad, none. And read the rest of the story. We know it well with Joseph. And not just the Joseph story. As we talked about last week, some of these boys will commit genocide. What chance do they have? Their moms were too busy fighting the family war, who themselves were mistreated by their own father, who saw them as means to his greedy ends. So, anyways, it's good stuff. Don, you had some? The other Don?
Joseph was, Jacob was fed up to the point where he didn't love either one of them or any of the group.
There is a lot of debate as what to do with Jacob here. He never once confronts the issue. In fact, it bothers me. Are we still recording?
Almost.
Right.
That'll make people curious.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if you go to my Patreon and